Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of our conference, COVID-19, Changing Culture. I hope that many of the attendees that are here this morning were able to join us yesterday and take part in some of the conversations, enjoy the panels and the discussions that were had. This session that we're starting with on day 2 is COVID-19, the Great Unequaliser. We're here for about an hour, and the topic that we're going to be exploring with our panel of 6 fantastic colleagues is how and why is COVID-19 exacerbating existing inequalities in the sector, and what can we do to counteract this? So my name is Sari Morris-Slee. I'm the head of Salford's Culture and Place Partnership, which is the cultural compact leading the strategy for culture, creativity and place in Salford, Greater Manchester. I am a woman in my early 40s, white. I have light brown hair, which is pulled back, and a navy blue turtleneck. I'm in a room that's lightly colored. There's a window partially open in the background and a painting on the wall. In a few minutes, we're going to introduce the panelists, and as these sessions tend to be really interactive, which is wonderful, please do feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves to see who is with us on the session today. Also want to thank Trish, who did live transcribing beautifully yesterday and is going to be doing so again. And you can see in the chat already that there's a caption to be able to click on and join that. You can, as you join, I want to just remind all of us that to help Trish and those that are using this particular service, if we can avoid speaking at the same time and as slowly as possible, I say as somebody who tends to always sort of rush through, it'll make the discussion easier for her to catch. So we have a really fantastic panel this morning. I'm spoiled to get to chair it. We have, in alphabetical order, Anna Enold Daniloff, who is the co-founder and joint CEO of the Parents and Carers in Performing Arts, and she also comes with a background as a theatre director. Jess Hunt, who is project lead at East Durham Creates, which works with and some of the most deprived areas in Tees Valley and demonstrates the value of art as a tool for empowerment. We have Jess Gray, who joins us as a postgraduate researcher from Leeds, with a particular interest in how to value arts, health and well-being, and the effects of cultural participation in age and health inequalities. We have Oliver Mantell joining us as the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency. Tajpal Rathore is joining us as Co-Artistic Director of Tribe Arts, an award-winning, radical political and actor-led theatre and media production company based in Leeds. And last but certainly not least, Tal Friedman, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Sheffield, and his current research focuses on the pandemic's impact of employment on cultural occupations and art consumption. So we really are bringing a fantastic breadth and depth of experience, expertise, and research into this conversation about inequality and inequity in the cultural sector. And like I said, how we really need to start thinking about how we counteract that individually and collectively. So there are going to be a round of presentations. Each person is going to speak, sometimes just on their own and others with slides. And then there will be time for discussion and time for you to ask your questions. It might seem a very specific thing, but as you have things bubbling up, please do share them, whether they're responses to what somebody might be saying or specific questions. If you do have a question, do put it into the Q&A part of the chat. It gives our backstage geniuses who are helping all of this work a chance to then put the question itself onto the screen. And you can also raise your hand at the bottom of the phrase to be invited onto the stage to ask your question directly if, for this first session, you're ready to join the group with your face as well as your voice and your questions. So without and then afterwards, we'll dive into that Q&A. I'll ask some questions, and really in many ways, those have been some of the richest parts when what's happening in the chat, the expertise that have been shared by the panel, that we can start mixing this together. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Jess Hunt for the first presentation.
Hi. I'm Jess Hunt, so I'm the project lead for East Durham Creates. I'm a 30-something-year-old white woman with very blonde hair in a ponytail and glasses. I'm wearing a black sloganed t-shirt which says "Life is full of sweet things," but you can only see the top part of it. And I'm currently sitting in a cupboard, which is not that interesting to describe. So I've come today to speak very specifically about the project's my project's COVID journey as an arts organisation that's embedded within and led by a non-arts crisis response organisation, and about the distinct advantages that that gave us when the pandemic hit in 2020 in terms of continuing to deliver our project, as well as the lessons that we can learn from this as a sector. So there's a slight difference from what I was introduced. So I used to work in the Tees Valley, but my project's based in some of the most deprived communities in County Durham. So we're a Creative People and Places project based in the east of County Durham. So for anyone who doesn't necessarily know where that is, it's the bit between Hartlepool and Sunderland, the coastline, and then slightly inland. We were founded in 2014, so we're one of the second round from the original branch of Creative People and Places projects, which are funded by Arts Council England. We're based in Peterlee, on one of the most deprived wards in the country, so Eden Hill. So our offices are actually based on one of those most deprived wards. And for those of you that aren't familiar with our area, we're primarily former mining villages with a new town, Peterlee, and then a merged town, which used to be mining villages called Seaham. So very dispersed communities as well. For us as a project, the defining moment was in 2018. The lead role of our project was taken over by a VCS charity called East Durham Trust, which is very focused on tackling poverty and deprivation in the local area. So originally we were led by Beamish Museum as an arts organisation, but in order to embed the project further, our consortium became led by East Durham Trust. The Trust has a really good reputation, particularly within County Durham, for being very responsive to the needs of the local community and being innovative in the ways that it meets that. So it runs a really wide range of projects, ranging from debt advice centre to food bank to mental health interventions to sports, anything that is highlighted as a need within the community. This meant that when COVID hit in March 2020, unlike a lot of other arts organisations or other Creative People and Places projects, we had a really unique advantage in being able to continue to provide cultural opportunities for those who already find it hard to engage with culture, but suddenly had even more barriers preventing them from being able to. So unlike a lot of projects, we were able to work with the crisis nature of East Durham Trust and continue to deliver what we were doing, but in line with what they were doing in response to the pandemic. The Trust's a very reactive organisation in many respects. It's always responding to the needs of the community, and we've learned a lot from the way that they work. So when other people were furloughed or working from home, we were still working within the community where we're based. And we were able to work with those crisis interventions, so whether that was food parcels, whether that was hot meal delivery, whether that was pack delivery to older isolated adults, we were able to essentially piggyback off what they were doing. So from my perspective as a CPP, a lot of other projects like us were kind of saying how they were trying to knock on the door of crisis intervention services like food banks, like mental health services that were already incredibly stretched, or all the staff were working from home, or they'd closed down the service and furloughed everyone, where we were already there embedded. And so we already had our feet under the table. They already knew us. They already understood how we worked, and we understood how they worked. So we were able to just form a partnership. In turn, we were able to help them to think a bit more creatively about how they would respond to the challenges of COVID. So if you're doing packed lunches, is there a way you could do pack delivery in that, and all that type of thing. So this ranged from a ton of different types of delivery, from packs added to food parcels. The Trust runs a 5-day-a-week advocate-led food bank, but it had to adapt and become self-referral and do home deliveries to large-scale murals, did new digital music, making spaces, to projecting onto the sides of community venues. And for us, we couldn't really fall back on digital delivery because we have a really high level of digital exclusion and digital data poverty within our area. So it was really important for us to continue to think of a practical and in-person safe solution. So large scale pack delivery, all that type of thing. And since the pandemic began in late March, we reached over 30,000 people in this way, working collaboratively with East Durham Trust. But there's lots of other people who have fallen through the gaps and who don't have organisations like us that are embedded. So it's become really obvious to us the necessity of working earlier with organisations like East Durham Trust and establishing those relationships. So as we look to COVID and how inequality has increased, we need to equally, as a cultural sector, address the lessons that COVID taught us about the value of non-arts organisations in reaching those people, and not just when a crisis forces us to do it. I've had a 1 minute warning, which was over my 5 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Incredibly succinct and really wonderful to get that last summary about the lesson that you're learning and encouraging others to consider it as well. Tajpal, I wonder if we can hear from you next.
Hi guys, good morning. Yeah, my name's Tajpal Thor. I'm the co-artistic director and executive producer and lead artist actually of a theatre company based in Tribe Arts, and we make work for second and third generation Black and Asian communities. I'm an Asian man wearing a black t-shirt today in a slightly gloomy room, so hopefully the sunshine will come out at some point. So during the pandemic, I guess for me, I'm kind of really coming at this very much a making kind of artist perspective, kind of producing our own work and the sort of inequalities that had already existed before but were just exacerbated during the pandemic. And maybe the pandemic also revealed some new kind of perspectives and new ways of looking at certain inequalities that kind of had formed and warped and evolved. Company primarily, but we kind of work across art forms, so whether it's TV, film, recorded, digital, where for us we're kind of driven by the story. So, and we're quite a small nimble organization, so I guess we were both in a very unexpected situation when COVID hit, but we were also in a position like many other companies that are not sort of clunky institutions. We're able to respond a little bit quicker than sort of other institutions that might have loads of levels of bureaucracy or safeguarding and sort of looking at other sort of financial models, which we didn't really need to do. For us, one of the things that we did was kind of reappropriate and kind of realign our skill set towards this sort of new digital or increased digital use of technology during the pandemic. So we actually launched an online publication which was called Offstage Sign, and to my knowledge, I think it is still the only publication in the UK that's dedicated to Black and Asian theatre and culture. It's essentially the stage, but for Black and Asian work. It was really, I mean, we literally turned into a publishing house overnight, which was quite crazy. And we've tried to hold the space since then. And it's actually, there has been benefits to that. But I think in terms of the making of it and the running of that kind of organization, of that type of work stream, which is primarily nothing to do with us being actors, but actually us curating and bringing together a range of writers, speakers, looking at the ecology of the sort of Black and Asian arts within the UK. It revealed a lot of things I think maybe people don't realize, even Black and Asian artists within the art sector that don't realize. I mean, really simple things like noticing the lack of Black and Asian shows, the small runs of Black and Asian shows, the financial models that underpin some of these shows, the lack of infrastructure, the fact that there aren't any bricks and mortar buildings that are focused purely on this type of work, for instance, or focused on this work on a regular long-term basis, and even things like the lack of critics of color, like people of color who can write about the work. I mean, that was just unbelievably crazy. I mean, also being in the north as well, I suppose that had its own inequalities, given the fact that we're a very London-centric nation. So that kind of revealed a lot of things, because a lot of the shows that we were covering actually, were so far removed from us. And it was very, very difficult. And I think it was just crazy how, realizing that actually having, an idea like Offstage, realizing that the inequalities are actually are so deep and so unconscious as well, on a certain level, that we've kind of passed some of these questions by, and they've only been revealed because we've had a crazy idea to turn into a publication house overnight, and that's been quite an eye-opener. I think also as well, just quickly to kind of get in the mix, is obviously there was already talk around sort of Black and Asian communities being at higher risk during the COVID pandemic for all sorts of reasons, not least socioeconomic, and sort of generational, sort of medical reasons as to why that might be in the makeup of sort of families and things. And I think that was definitely exacerbated during the pandemic, because whereas most people were, from a sort of institutional perspective, most institutions within the arts sector, were taking their time to respond, were, looking at, were getting guidance from their boards and all this kind of stuff. A lot of Black and Asian artists that are not really in senior positions, were actually focused on survival in terms of their art, but also survival in terms of their well-being and their sort of physical health. So it was like a sort of double whammy that we were kind of really negotiating during the pandemic, and it made it increasingly difficult to be able to continue being called an artist during the pandemic. So yeah, I mean, Offstage is still going. We've weirdly kind of come out of this pandemic bifurcated in terms of the sort of organizational capacity that we have. We've kind of got two organizations on the outskirts of it, so it's been a blessing, but very much in disguise. And I think it's really something that I'd obviously love to talk more about in terms of some of the inequalities that raised. But yeah, I've also been given a 1 minute warning, so I don't know if I've gone over that.
Perfection. Thank you so much. And if you do have links for Offstage, please do put them in the chat. I think it would be fantastic to be able to access that, share it, and just dig deeper into what you introduced.
I'll do that right away.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to turn to Anna, and I believe she has some slides to accompany her presentation.
I do, but only to sum up basically what I want to say. So hi everybody, I'm Anna Inoltena-Elof. I'm the co-founder and the joint CEO of Parents and Carers in Performing Arts, which is quite a nameful, so we call it PIPA for short, and I will refer to this throughout as PIPA. So I'm a white female. I'm in my 40s. I've got dark shoulder length hair. I'm wearing glasses. I'm wearing a turquoise shirt and a black jacket with it. And the accent you might spot is German-Bulgarian, because that is my heritage. Just quickly about PIPA. So PIPA is an organization which raises awareness of the challenges that parents and carers working in the performing arts face. We conduct research, we lobby for change, and then we provide data-driven solutions to performing arts organizations to support their parents and carer workforce. And that is really because we believe that a truly world-class performing arts is inclusive of all talents and circumstances. We launched the PIPA Best Practice Charter and a supporting program a few years ago in order to support the industry more. But what I want to talk about a little bit, or share first, is some of the research that we've done. And some of it is from pre-COVID, and some of it is during COVID, because it very much informs what seems to be happening in the sector. So if you could share the first slide, that would be great. Parents and carers working in performing arts in general, they struggle to stay in the industry and progress in their careers because there is a lack of support structures and appropriate working practices and policies. There is in general a culture of long and unsociable working hours, low pay, last minute changes to schedules, touring, of course, which makes a career in the performing arts incredibly challenging for people with caring responsibilities. And what is really important is that we mustn't forget that caring responsibilities cut across every other protected characteristic and is therefore really a key element of the whole diversity and equality discourse. And it's also important to keep in mind that caring responsibilities still fall predominantly to women, which makes them then the primary carers. So some of the research, and I will obviously share the sort of the hardest hitting things, are that so our research had found that 7 out of 10 performing arts workers regularly turn down work due to their caring responsibilities. And that is even higher for freelancers, at 85% of freelancers with caring responsibilities having to regularly turn down work. And that's important because the performing arts sector is mainly made out of freelancers. We also identified that parents and carers experience a pay penalty of £3,000, and that is significant, especially if you take into account the high cost of childcare that we have. And I think the average cost of a part-time nursery, it's only part-time, is £6,300 per year for a child under 2. So £3,000 actually goes quite a way. To mitigate the cost of caring, we found that parents and carers working in the performing arts rely heavily on social capital to manage their caring responsibilities, which is a privilege in itself. So those without those privileges, especially without the social network of support, find it most difficult to remain in the careers. Now, COVID really exacerbated all these inequalities. During COVID, caring responsibilities have become much more visible. If you think about all the Zoom meetings where kids come in, I forgot to talk about my room. I'm sitting in my son's bedroom, which has become my office recently. So COVID has not changed, but actually just highlighted and exacerbated everything that we have found. In our COVID research, we found that 1 in 4 women in the performing arts had involuntarily become the full-time caregiver, which heavily impacted their ability to work or to seek work during a time when financial pressures are high and where parents and carers continuously feel unable to even compete for opportunities in that very competitive market. And before the pandemic, we had found that 4 out of 10 people who had left the industry had done that because of their caring responsibilities. However, during our latest COVID research, we found that 72% of parents and carers are now considering to leave the industry. That's a huge number. It's women, self-employed people, and people with additional protective characteristics and without the social capital who are particularly at risk of leaving our industry. This is an immense talent loss that the performing arts is potentially facing, and it shows the urgent need to put strategies in place to retain the diverse talent. If we could just switch to the second slide. I'm not going to talk long about what the sector can do, because we can talk about that later, I think. But I just wanted to highlight a few things. So we run a charter program with performing arts organizations, supporting them to put practices in place to support parents and carers to help attract them and retain them. And I just thought I'll share a few important ones or key ones. One is about monitoring, because there is a real data gap. Organizations don't know the makeup of their workforce. So by monitoring caring responsibilities on equal opportunity forms or even on staff service, you start to get an idea what your makeup of the workforce is. Integrating flexible working, job design, flexible working is key. We know that it's an enabler for many groups. It supports work-life balance. It includes remote working, job shares, but also truncated rehearsal hours, for example. Then obviously communicating what organizations actually have in place and how to access it, and that they might have a family-friendly ethos, because we found that parents and carers self-select out because they think an opportunity might not even be possible for them. And of course, to then find ways to support with the cost of caring. And that doesn't necessarily have to be with financial resources, it can be with simple actions like giving enough notice and scheduling in advance, avoiding the last minute changes, so that because last minute changes, if you have to stay longer for a meeting or a rehearsal, that is very costly if you pay for child or elder care. Or enabling remote access for meetings or auditions or interviews to avoid the additional time and cost that travel can then obviously bring. As I said, these are just a few things, and I'm looking forward to discuss what else the industry and everybody can do to increase work-life balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That's fantastic. And really being able to dig in more in both the Q&A part and also when we get into the deep dive lounge rooms to really dig into the questions around workforce, creative professionals, and the realities rather than and how they're changing. So thank you for that. It's my pleasure to now turn to Karen for your presentation.
Thank you, Sari. So my name's Karen Gray and I am a researcher at the Centre for Cultural Value. I am a white woman in her early 50s with shoulder-length brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a really quite dull dark green top today, and I'm sitting in my messy kitchen. So over the past 15 months, I've been looking in depth through a series of interviews at how the crisis has been affecting theatre, particularly across England, and museums and galleries in the northeast and the northwest of England. This morning, I'm going to focus mainly on the cultural workforce, and I'm going to reflect on one main observation that is really centred in the experience of some of the people I've interviewed, but I am also going to say one thing about audiences. So in late 2020, last year, I spoke with a theatre freelancer, a stage manager, who was getting through the year by working in a care home and claiming self-employed income support when it became available. Reflecting on their career in the light of the pandemic, to me, they said, it's made me think, why am I working in theatre? It just doesn't offer any security, pay rises just don't exist, the equity rate goes up so slowly, and that's just accepted. It's a mad industry to work in anyway, and then to have something happen like this. So the observation I'd like to highlight, and Anna and previous speakers have also, that what they've said also supports this. If the sector has been resilient during the pandemic, this may at least partly be the result of the capacity and the willingness of individuals, both employed and freelance, to labour in ways that have often gone far beyond their job descriptions, that have sometimes been invisible and sometimes also detrimental to their health and well-being. And although this was exaggerated by the pandemic, it also reflects normality outside of it, as we all know. People I interviewed described the experience of working during the pandemic in the same breath as they talked about things like entry into the sector, career progression within it, and pay and working conditions. And I'm sure other people in this session will suggest too, there are lots of reasons why people working in the arts and cultural sector will have experienced the pandemic differently. And this might be to do with the sector they work in, their age, their gender, their colour, their socio-economic background, and so on. Geography's also made a difference, as Jess was saying earlier, perhaps because of the way in which support was distributed and the cultural infrastructure that is in place. So if you lived those kinds of differences during the pandemic, then your capacity and your willingness to labour in the way in which the sector needed was affected. It is important to note that this might have been for better as well as for worse. And Ellen Renton beautifully pointed this out in our opening plenary yesterday. Working remotely and flexibly did make life and work easier for some groups, such as those with physical disabilities. And as Anna was saying, for individuals during the pandemic, access to networks and existing structures of support has been really vital, although of course those same networks and structures could also be exclusionary. The thing I wanted to say about audiences is from the point of view of organisations, and it is linked to what I've said about the workforce. So with buildings not open, many organisations turned a much greater portion of their attention towards some of those whose access to arts and culture has always historically been unequal. And they describe work with young carers, other vulnerable young people, refugees and asylum seekers, those living with dementia and so on. And they might have had established programs with those groups, but doing that kind of engagement without physical presence involved an enormous amount of creativity and innovation, leading to things like doorstep delivery, concerts on Teams that would mix recordings and kind of live audience feedback, sessions on the telephone or on Zoom, exhibitions in windows, all of the kind of things that Jess was talking about earlier. As one museum director told me, it also involved acknowledging that some of those people being reached in that way might never want or be able to enter through the doors of any cultural venue, and that had to be okay. Thinking now about where we might look for positive change, I think locally, for the workforce, we might want to look towards peer support networks that are kind of deeply embedded in an understanding of place, such as the Tyne and Weir Cultural Freelancers Network. Audiences are really also going to benefit from the kind of unique local partnerships that we've already heard about, involving creative organisations and third sector or non-arts groups that have flourished during the pandemic. And organisations are making steps towards change. People have talked to me about using resources for recruitment, such as the Open Hire platform and the government's Kickstart apprenticeships programme. They've diversified boards. They've applied learning from diversity training, such as through the INCART's anti-racism toolkit and the resources produced by parents and carers in performing arts. I guess the question now is how we make sure that the pressures of financial recovery don't compromise this. And I'm definitely out of time, so thank you really for listening. I'm going to leave it there.
That's fantastic, Karen, and really wonderful to have a couple points to be able to focus on. Thank you very much. I'm next going to turn to Tal. Thank you very much.
Hey, good morning. Nice to see you all. I'm Tal Friedman. I'm a white 40-year-old male with light-colored hair, and I'm wearing glasses and a black T-shirt, sitting in my room with two bookshelves in the background. What I'll present to you today is some main results from a work we have been doing in our research team that includes also Dave O'Brien, Mark Taylor, Siobhan McAndrew, and Rebecca Florison. What we were doing is looking at data from the ONS Labor Force Survey that provides really high-quality labor market data. It allows to really compare and to quantify the effect of the pandemic on the workforce, not only looking at the initial shock around March 2020, but also at the longer trends of recovery or lack thereof. The pandemic really, of course, exacerbated the precarity of disadvantaged workers, but it was such a dramatic and an all-encompassing event that it affected also the stronger workers at the first step. There was a brief moment at the very beginning of the pandemic in some subsectors of the creative workforce where we saw some kind of a leveling down effect, where ironically and sadly, the reduction of activity across the board led to reduced inequality levels. At that period, there were some voices talking about rebooting the creative industries, restarting, but as recovery happened in the place where it happened, we found that inequalities are recovering too, and that gaps are reopening again. I'll share with you some evidence. When we analyzed the data, we looked at several indicators. First of all, we looked at the size of the workforce to document loss of jobs in the creative workforce. But that is not the whole story, since many workers kept their jobs, at least nominally, but were in reality working less hours or no hours at all. So we looked also at the average amount of hours worked per week per worker. And also as a measure for the overall activity of the sector, we looked at the total hours worked per week. So we concentrated on the core creative occupations, which include the music, performing, and the visual arts, the museums, galleries, and libraries, which are more in-person consumption types of creative production, and also on the film, TV, video, radio, and photography, and the publishing subsector, which are more remote, let's say, or prone to online consumption types, which had the effect on the creative labor force itself. So if first we take a moment to take a long shot at the core creative professions, we saw the pandemic had an effect of a large decline in average weekly hours from 26 to 20, which is larger than the average effect decline that we saw in the rest of the economy. And we do see a partial recovery in 2020, but still to a level that is lower than the pre-pandemic period. So this is a broad picture, but if we zoom in, we see that there's a big difference between different subsectors within the core creative workforce. Music, performing, and visual arts occupations were more dramatically hit than other subsectors. They experienced an enormous job loss of around 60 to 70,000 workers, almost a quarter of the workforce who left their occupation. And this job loss continued through 2020 without showing any signs of recovery. The extent of this crisis became even more accentuated if we look at instead of job losses, at the level of activity, the total hours worked per week. Here we see a decline by half of around 2 million working hours per week. So think of it both as a loss of livelihood and income for these creative workers, but also a loss of cultural creation and creativity to the whole of society. When we look at the profile of workers, we see that also different workers were differently affected. The pandemic broke a positive trend of increase in women participation in the workforce in the music and performing and visual arts. We see that young workers below 30 years old were also more vulnerable to the effect of the pandemic, and they're more likely to reduce their level of activity or lose their job. We know also the core creative workforce has a high share of highly educated workers. Highly educated workers with some academic education saw a lower reduction in activities and lower educated workers without academic education, and this higher education individuals were able to recover more efficiently. And mostly there is a big crisis in the work of self-employed workers. Self-employed workers were the predominant type of work in the core creative industries before the pandemic, but since the pandemic we see an enormous decline, and we see for the first time in many years that there is more work being done in the core creative industry and core creative occupations by employed workers rather than self-employed workers who suffered really a lot of reductions. I just want to say briefly that we don't see this reduction in all subsectors. For example, music, performing, and visual arts occupations were hit the hardest, but publishing subsector was more resilient to the effect of the pandemic. And the film, TV, video, and radio and photography suffered a large reduction at the beginning, but were able to recover almost all their level of activity by the end of 2020. And just last word about intersectionality. I talked here about each characteristics by its own, gender, age, and education. But of course, in real life, workers have they have age, education, gender, ethnicity, etc. And in more complicated analysis, we found that this combination belonging to several disadvantaged groups at the same time has some kind of a negative multiplier effect that exacerbates the precarity of these workers to an extent which is bigger than the sum of its parts, let's say. For example, and here it connects well with Anna's presentation, we were able to show that in the case of parenting, being both, all young parent and co-creative worker during the pandemic brought an extra working hours penalty, which was not found for older parents or for workers in other occupational groups. So I'll stop here and I'll invite you to read more details in the report that will be due to be published soon.
That's fantastic. And I think there's such a power in hearing the anecdotal and much more specific, whether it's sector, place, a group of workers, with the data that's coming out from both the interviews and the wider ONS surveys. Finally, and last but not least, I'd love to turn to Oliver for your presentation.
Hi, thanks. Just hopefully you can all hear me. Brilliant. So yes, I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm Director of Evidence at the Audience Agency. I'm a middle-aged, middle-ish age maybe, blonde-haired male, wearing a black t-shirt. So just before I start really, I'm going to be talking largely from an audience and sort of public perspective, but I just wanted to flag, I guess, a distinction between three particular ideas. One, the idea of unrepresentativeness. So I'll be talking a lot about audience profile, things like that. Differential impacts on people. And then finally, structural inequality itself as a kind of underlying concept. And I think sometimes it's useful to keep those a little bit differentiated. I'll mainly be talking about the first two, but obviously they depend on, are impacted by, and impact structural inequality more generally. But broadly speaking, I'm going to be talking about 4 different periods in relation to COVID. Before, during, in terms of the immediate impacts, the kind of mitigations and way out of COVID, and then looking a little bit to the future, all of which in sort of like a minute each. So it will be brutally compressed, but hopefully that will be helpful. An incredibly obvious point to start with, as I think we all know, cultural engagement is what is euphemistically referred to as socially stratified, which is to say that certain types of people and certain types of more privileged people tend to engage and consume more, particularly a publicly funded culture. So broadly speaking, engagement is higher with higher levels of income, education, professional type, people who are able-bodied and white and so forth. So, I think that's a bit of a given. There is a bit of a question mark around age and how that links in, because generally speaking, there's higher engagement with culture overall for younger people, but for publicly funded culture, it sort of often skews in the other direction, which is maybe a conversation for another time. But anyway, so that was our, if you like, our starting position going into COVID. And when, obviously when COVID happened, the impacts, as again, I think we're all aware, compounded a lot of those existing inequalities. So the impacts of COVID in various different ways were worse for the groups that were already disadvantaged. And we in particular, in the Cultural Participation Monitor, so this population survey that we carried out, looked at the impact on people's time, the impact on people's money during COVID. And you can see quite clearly that certain groups who are more affluent, professional groups, et cetera, would often end up actually with more money, whereas lots of the rest of the population end up with less money for a variety of obvious reasons. But also when we look at the impact of people's time, the people who could carry on more or less as normal, with caveats around that, tended to be again from those privileged groups. So people who had either more time or less time, so more time if you're unemployed or unable to work, etc., but also if you're really super busy and have your children clambering over you while you're trying to do things, or you're trying to work extra hours to make up for a partner or whatever, tended to be lower income from Black and minority ethnicities and people with disabilities and so on and so on. So we're seeing complete compounding of the same kind of issue during COVID. There were some instances in terms of online engagement where the audience might have skewed a little bit more, if you like, more representative than the in-person audience pre-COVID. But generally speaking, there was a lot of churn in terms of who was doing things because suddenly lots of people's lives were turned upside down. And that was particularly true where inequality was there in the first place. On the way, if you like, out of COVID, or when we started to see measures that would help to make it better, things like vaccination and the like, of course, older people and people with disabilities were prioritized in terms of vaccination. But after that, again, you were much more likely to get vaccination and get vaccination early if you were more affluent and from higher education background, professional backgrounds, white, and so forth. So again, that's kind of compounding some of these issues. And what we did see when we looked at people's attitudes to risk, either how they were feeling about going out and doing things, or how much of a risk they felt in terms of catching COVID, that it wasn't that. So the more privileged groups were more cautious in many ways. So older affluent groups in more rural areas tend to be more cautious. But it wasn't that they necessarily had a greater sense of risk. It just maybe they'd soaked up less risk all the way through. So the kind of marginal extra risk they would need to take was proportionately much greater. So I think that's probably what was driving some of that greater reluctance. They weren't having to travel to work on public transport all the way through the lockdowns and all that kind of thing. So again, the pictures have been compounding and compounding and compounding. However, it's possible there'll be a little bit of a shift when we start looking to the future. We asked people whether they expected to engage more or less after COVID than they, in the future relative to before COVID. And it's a bit of a mixed picture. So generally speaking, people are expecting to do less. They're expecting to do less, even more than they were a few months ago. But younger people with family, with caring responsibilities, and people in particularly large cities, particularly London, are relatively speaking more likely to be doing more. So you might see a bit of a tilt in the representative of the audience in the future, but that of course doesn't mean that the differential impacts have gone away, or indeed the structural inequality has. So yeah, there we are.
That's fantastic, and to have those 4 points covered in 6 minutes, I salute all of you. I'd love to. We're going to dig into the Q&A. We don't have a ton of time, so I'd love to pose a question. We select one from the Q&A, and it means maybe everybody's not going to get to speak. But just as a reminder, we'll be able to go into the deep dive lounges afterwards for some of the deeper conversations around both workforce and audience. So I want to start sort of pulling out some of the points that have emerged from the research project. First, some of the findings are that older and more established freelancers with more developed professional networks have been able to draw on peer support to secure work in this time. And younger freelancers, as we've heard, under 25 had been most at risk at losing hours or leaving the sector altogether. And that overall, a disproportionate impact on freelancers, particularly those excluded from the government support packages, these have been a dominant theme. So when thinking about networks, the way that we connect to each other and the ability to either survive or the impetus to stay in the industry, I want to ask to those on the panel who want to respond, if there's a culture of who you know, being able to sustain how you continue, either ideas or examples of how networks or peer support networks, the ways that we connect, have helped people going forward. And again, either ideas or examples. Anybody want to come on that? Karen, that's fantastic. Go ahead.
I can go in. I mean, certainly that from the interviews, there is definitely an element of that. I mean, it's not surprising. That's not a surprising thing. I think one of the interesting things, though, was that during the pandemic, people had more time, and there were lots of really interesting examples of relatively senior people really going out of their way and making really quite exciting ways to connect with people, younger people, people emerging into the industry, people in different geographic areas, and I just wonder if there's ways to continue that kind of movement that we should look at funding, making time for, particularly within organisations, supporting people to do that.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. Go ahead, Anna.
I just want to also point out how networks are really important for role modeling and for learning. So one of the things that we keep hearing is that parents and carers quite often lose their network, because when you're out, especially women, when they are out of the industry for a year, they feel that they're not connected anymore to who they were connected before. You get very quickly forgotten. But what I've also noticed is I just recently, we were doing some research in dance and how it's infected in dance. What is interesting is that if you don't see it, if you don't see other dancers who have caring responsibilities, who are managing to stay in the industry, you feel you are on your own and you can't do it. So connecting to a network of people in a similar situation who have been through a journey and who can share their journey is actually key. And I think that needs to be supported a lot from organizations as well, to enable these networks to bring people together, to talk, to share experiences.
Really great insight. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about children and young people, the concept of you've got to see it to be it. If you don't see that it's possible, you don't imagine what's possible for yourself. But I think it's really important, thank you, to highlight how important that is as adults and peers, as well as thinking up into a career. Tajpal, did you want to come back to say something as well?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I find it, I find it very curious that there is a sense that actually if you're more seasoned within the arts sector, you were more able to sort of pull the networks that you have and therefore potentially stay in the arts sector. But then at the same time, we've had Tariq Isakunda, who's the artist director of Battersea Arts Centre, recently talk about he made a series of tweets a couple of weeks ago around the lack of people in specialist areas that have been able to retain in the art sector, and arguably there probably is a connection between specialist areas and seasoned leaders. So they seem to be a little bit contradictory, and the fact that there is now a lack, or that he's observed that there's a lack of those specialist individuals, that's obviously increased the sort of pay for the pay increase for some of these people, which has then had an impact on organizations like ours, for instance, or other Black and Asian organizations, or other organizations that have less resource, not necessarily early career, but less resource, means that actually those organizations can't access those people because they are now just too expensive, and the resource that they have, the funding that they have, or the level that they are within funding criteria is not something that they can access, and therefore there's potentially been a hold on progressive organizational development, collaboration, cross collaboration between certain artists and networks. So I just find that those sets of data being a little bit contradictory, but then also what that might reveal as well.
It's a fantastic point. And, as the emerging scarcity, it's hard to then keep up in terms of guidance of pay, what that's building into funding applications, and just how every business model has to be, so fleet of foot. I think, actually, I want to say something, but I'm going to keep it to myself and go back to the group. I'd love to turn to the Q&A and the question from Nina White from the Paul Hamlin Foundation. She asks, how can we better connect work to address inequities in the creative and cultural sector to wider political and economic change? I mean, a great question, quite small, not very deep, really great big question. Does anybody have a response about connecting work, how there's so much individual activity, small network, hyper-local, some of it there are big sort of national campaigns, but at this point, since there's been so much change, I'd love to hear any responses people might have about connecting work to address inequities.
Could I also maybe talk about just
Yes.
the massive thing that obviously happened during the pandemic, which was the re-emergence of the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd.
Yeah.
An organization like Tribe Arts, we're very much focused around that idea of, the mission of our organization is to end racism. Potentially something that's never going to happen because of the way that we know it exists and the way it perpetuates within society. But the ambition is always there, and so for us, all our work has always been about connecting our work and trying to address those inequalities that are so blatant, with sort of wider political and economic sort of change that we require in that instance. I want to just quickly mention very briefly, and maybe we can talk about this in future sessions, but when we launched Offstage Design in issue 3, which you can find on the website and the link that I put in the chat, we have a strand within design called the Inquiry Desk, which looks at white-led organizations, or majority white-led organizations, and what they're doing in terms of the sort of EDI conversation. We focus on various different venues across the different issues, but in issue 3 we focused on the Culture Recovery Fund, and what was really interesting about that, now the Arts Council have not agreed that these statistics are correct, but our data sets were got from the statistics that were published by the Arts Council. But what we found was that there was a bit of a confusion, and I suppose an inequality that arose from that around terminologies of how organizations are described. So BAME-led organizations and and BAME organisations, and what that actually meant. We found that just over 10% of the total fund for the Culture Recovery Fund was awarded to around 313 organisations that identified as BAME-led. But then when we actually looked at the data and tried to actually apply the definition of what the Arts Council calls BAME-led, we found that actually it was just under 1% that was awarded the Culture Recovery Fund. Now, I know that that was obviously quite a unique fund in the way that that was done. It wasn't necessarily something that the Arts Council had any control over, or so they say, and it was something that came from central government. But there was this implication of the way that the funding was allocated, and that was just, you know, an example in time. But actually, that could exist for every data set ever made by the Arts Council in relation to how funding is given. And I think there is a correlation between funding allocation, connecting the work and the type of work that you do, and the scale of work that you do, and the impact that work can have, and you know, the wider political and economic change.
Absolutely, and thank you for that full response. Jess, I wonder, as you spoke about the work that you were doing in the pandemic and the partnership with a VCSE-led organization, to talk a little bit about connecting work and to maybe dig a little deeper into that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think the key in terms of the cultural sector working with this type of organisation is probably not leaving it until there's a crisis, and you have to work in advance to build that level of trust with organisations like that. And that's the only reason why we were able to kind of draw on their expertise and their connections into the community, because we already had that developed trust, where I know that other similar types of organisations have spoken to us about the difficulties that already stretched services trying to add something, saying, do you not want to add some culture to what you're doing already, type of thing, when they're in crisis mode. So I think it's all about working in advance and recognising non-arts organisations and the value that they bring, and the potential to work in partnership with them now, and knowing that if we were to go into another crisis, that if we have those established relationships, then we work together and we can bring a lot to what they do as well.
That's fantastic. So we only have a few minutes left in the session, and I want to end with, I'm going to borrow some things from the sessions yesterday, kind of a killer question, something looking more broadly. And I'm going to borrow from some things that have been said. The term trust and value and bravery have been things that have run through, just terms that keep coming up, not only in presentations, but very much in the discussions afterwards. So thinking about, Karen Dick said at the end of her session that not going back to normal or a new normal, but making a better normal should be the aim. So I'm going to start with, if you have the term or the sentence, if we were braver, we would, how would you want to finish that sentence? I'm going to go in the reverse order of, so do keep it brief since we're so close on time, but I'll go reverse order as we did in the presentations. So putting you on the spot first, Oliver.
Okay, very, very quickly then, I think from an audience point of view, trying to centre what the public actually value, so taking a more kind of cultural democracy kind of approach, at an organisational level, making sure that we properly value the skills and relationships that relate to having a better connection to the whole of society. And that may mean, therefore, downplaying some of the other sort of middle-class professional things that otherwise get people jobs.
Amazing, thank you. Tal, on to you.
Yeah, okay, I'll be very technical. I would say that art organizations and the art workforce should set really tangible, measurable goals for reducing inequality, and just do whatever it takes to reach those goals.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Karen, on to you.
Introduce some kind of universal basic income.
Excellent. Love it. Anna, on to you.
I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to say we would truly embed and value work-life balance to make everything accessible for everyone.
Wonderful. It's very exciting hearing these. Taj Paul, next to you things.
Yeah, I think we would get real about EDI work and get less performative and more actionable around work concerning diversity, representation and inclusion.
Bravo. And last but not least to you, Jess.
I think if we were braver, we would accept that there are other people who know how to access audiences better than we do as a sector, and rely on their expertise and build those relationships in advance of when we actually need them.
Amazing. Thank you. Those really wrap up so much and take us nicely onto the deep dive tables. As a guidance, table A, we're going to have Tajpal, Anna, and Tal to talk about workforce, and on table B in the lounge, we have Jess, Karen, and Oliver talking about audiences. But I want to give a huge thank you so much to all 6 panelists today. What a wonderful way to kick off day 2 of the conference, and we look forward to continuing these conversations in the lounges.